Nice.
Yeah.
What you're hearing are the sounds of people everywhere putting on Bombas socks, underwear, and T-shirts made from absurdly soft materials that feel like plush clouds. Yeah, that plush. And the best part? For every item you purchase, Bombas donates another to someone facing homelessness.
Bombas. Big comfort for everyone. Go to bombas.com/ACAST and use code ACAST for 20% off your first purchase. That's bombas.com/ACAST. Code ACAST.
Hiring for your small business? If you're not looking for professionals on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. That's like looking for your car keys in a fish tank. LinkedIn helps you hire professionals you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job but might be open to the perfect role. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't even visit other leading job sites. So start looking in the right place. With LinkedIn, you can hire professionals like a professional. Post your free job on linkedin.com/spoken today.
Millions of people have lost weight with personalized plans from Noom. Like Evan, who can't stand salads and still lost 50 pounds.
Salads generally for most people are the easy button, right? For me, that wasn't an option. I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. But Noom worked for me.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
Hello again, folks. Welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars podcast, a slightly unexpected episode for you in the run-up to New Year's Eve, but not quite the last of the much-loved mini-series that has been War of 1812 month and 3/4, if we're being quite honest. It's been fantastic. We've done a lot of social history along the way. Yes, we've done some military, but I've enjoyed this kind of focus of looking at it in a slightly different kind of vein. And we're going to do exactly the same thing again today, because we're going to look at impressment within the context of the War of 1812. One of those things that was certainly a kind of catalyst for the outbreak of the war. Whether or not it's the single most important cause, I think, is something that we'll discuss over the course of the next hour. But to help me unpick this, I am joined once again by the excellent Nick Kaizer. Nick, as you will know, is a Napoleonic commentator. He's a teacher in Canada, and he is author of Revenge in the Name of Honor, the Royal Navy's quest for vengeance in the single ship actions of the War of 1812, which is available from Hellion. You'll have heard Nick on the show very recently, helping to add to the level of knowledge that has come out of War of 1812 month. But today, he's got a standalone episode. I should actually say we did do a recording a long time back on the Naval War of 1812. So folks, I will stick a link, just like I did last time, I will stick a link to that episode in the show notes, in the descriptor to this episode, so that you can go and catch up on that one. We won't just repost it. But it was a fantastic one. Nick, great to see you again, my friend. Merry Christmas. How are you doing?
Merry Christmas. I'm doing very well. Thanks again for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. We're going to dive in. We're going to start with the basics. Impressment, it's a word that we think we know. Certainly, I think I know what I think it means, but I'm sure there's a much more kind of complex story behind it all. So let's start with the sort of the what's, the hows, and the whys. What is it physically? How does it work? And, you know, why does the government feel that this is necessary during this period? Not just within the UK, but also around the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, so at a basic level, and you're probably correct in what you think impressment is, your listeners probably are as well, it's a form of conscription used by the Royal Navy. That's very basic. It's conscription at sea, a draft at sea. So we'll start with why that's needed. And we have to think about the fleet, the Royal Navy. When the Royal Navy was mobilized for war, during the late 1800s, early 1800s, late 1700s, it fielded hundreds of ships, thousands if you count the smaller sloops and bomb catches and all the rest, and transports. Some of these ships need as many as 700 or 800 men, so essentially an infantry battalion. When the Navy went to war in 1793, it therefore needed an immense body of men to sail and fight its ships. The peacetime Navy in 1790 employed about 16,000 men. By 1797, well into the French Revolutionary Wars, it employed 120,000 men. It's a huge increase on mobilization. Hundreds of ships go from being expensive storage spaces and dockyards to active ships of war. They need to be manned. On top of that, there are high rates of mortality and desertion on these ships. Every year during the war, deaths in battle, deaths from injury, disease, shipwreck, and desertion result in about 10% of the Navy's manpower disappearing, 10% annually. So every year, just from the get-go, 12,000 men are really needed to replace losses. That's already an immense challenge. Even worse, the Navy needs to expand throughout the Napoleonic Wars. For most of the conflict, Britain is without any allies with any amount of naval power. And at the height of Napoleon's power, he can call upon the navies of France, Spain, and Holland. So the Navy's ever expanding. It always needs more men, always needs more ships. And faced with that problem, the Navy was never able to fully man its fleet for willing volunteers alone. Now, this is one common misconception about impressment and the Royal Navy. There always were many volunteers. And for most of the Napoleonic Wars, they represent a majority of those serving in the fleet. But they're never enough. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is that naval pay is abysmal. By 1797, naval pay hadn't increased in over a century. So you, and all of your listeners, I'm sure, are feeling the effects of inflation right now. Imagine a century's worth of inflation without any increase in wages. That's a staggering problem. And many merchants at this time, indeed also the ships of the American Navy, pay better wages than the Royal Navy. And the other problem is that, compared to the Royal Navy, service on merchant ships is safer. Service on whaling ships or on privateers are more lucrative. Britain has this immense maritime world, thousands and thousands of ships of all types, and they all need men. And they're all competing for a relatively limited number of trained, able seamen. So impressment was needed to man Britain's wooden wall. Some foreign impressment had been going on in Britain for quite literally centuries. It was very common practice in Elizabethan times. But it really took off as the size of the Navy expanded during the 18th century. The most basic practice was of individual ships sending out gangs of seamen and officers, usually the most loyal men on board a ship, to literally go into towns or board merchant ships and just round up British sailors. And this has been occurring for centuries. During the 1700s, more systematic and organized methods are developed as well. The Impress Service, which is a dedicated force of Royal Navy personnel, is established, and it has dedicated groups of men in all the major ports of Britain whose job is to find sailors. Regardless of the method, these press gangs are authorized by British law to detain any trained sailors of British nationality for employment in the Royal Navy. Now, this was, and always had been, controversial. Now, the British state is proud of its rule of law, its ideals of liberty. So politicians found it impressive, embarrassing. Even the Royal Navy found it embarrassing. But given the scale of the problem of manpower, it was an evil of necessity. There's a great deal of historical debate on impressment. Traditional views was of a very violent, brutal system where press gangs would strike fear into local communities. They would grab landsmen and seamen alike. There'd be a lot of brutality in the actual act. More recently, historians have argued that it was a much more benign process, relatively free from violence. My thoughts, and they're dependent on the work of other scholars, I haven't done any work on this specifically, seems to be that impressment falls somewhere in the middle. It was not the cartoonishly brutal practice that you would see, in Victorian popular culture, but it could and did result in violence at times.
I'm still getting over that 10% desertion figure. That's horrendous. So the army, during the Peninsular War, the army's worst desertion stat is actually when the war is over and desertion spikes to something like 1.2% of troops deployed in the Iberian Peninsula. So nothing in the grand scheme of things. Often it hovers somewhere between 0.5% and something pathetic like 0.05%. So we're talking minuscule numbers. Granted, it is bigger during the, as we discussed in other episodes, during the War of 1812, where you've got a figure of something like 4%, I think, being not uncommon. But that's a long way from 10%. Is this?
Yeah. So and I might have misspoken. I hope I didn't. The 10% is everything. So it's death from battle, injury, shipwreck, and desertion. I don't know what the desertion rate is. I imagine it's much higher than the Army. And the reason for that is trained sailors were incredibly valuable and they had a lot of options. There were always ships who wanted to take on crew. So it was very, when you're a sailor in the Navy, you always have an incentive if you can to get away because you're probably going to find better employment somewhere else. Whereas I don't suspect that, Army soldiers were that valued in other industries in the same way. But I don't know what the actual rate of desertion is itself, but I do imagine it's higher than the Army.
Is there any ability for escape? Because I'm conscious that the militia has a system where you can kind of get out of it either by getting somebody to replace you just voluntarily, or you can have a situation where you pay somebody to take your slot if you get called. Is there an equivalent when it comes to impressment, or is it just, look, you know how to sail a ship, you're coming with us, son?
That's absolutely it. If you have, if you can prove to a captain that you have no maritime experience, technically they have to let you go, and most captains would do so. But it's up to the sailor to prove that. If you are a British subject and you have any amount of maritime experience in your past, that's usually signified by the slang you use, the way you speak, tattoos you might have. In addition, other sailors might have saw and recognized them. There's no way out.
How do people respond to basically being kidnapped and told, this is your life now, and if you don't like it and you run away, we can shoot you, and if you don't do what you're told, we will flog you, beat you? Thinking of starting here, going back to that discipline in the Navy episode. This is not, it's a very different way of doing things to how we're used to today. And I'm curious about whether or not people kind of resignedly accept their fate, or whether there are kind of counter responses to this. And I guess it depends from individual to individual, but I'm just curious what your sense is of that.
So current thinking tends to describe sailors' attitudes to impressment as an unfortunate annoyance, an occupational hazard. Many hated it. Many took great lengths to avoid it. But for the most part, British sailors accepted that it was a hazard of the trade. And another general consensus is that usually they accepted their lot once they were impressed. It's hard to say too much on this because we just don't have many accounts from the perspective of common sailors. I think we have more accounts from British soldiers from this period than Jack Tars, but that there are some, and they suggest that impressment was again viewed as that occupational hazard. It sucked to be pressed into service, but it's a hazard of the occupation. Sailors moved throughout this world all the time. They moved from ship to ship, from one nationality to the other, in and out of the merchant service, into Navy ships, privateers, whalers. And some sailors we know, they were pressed. They spent time evading the press gangs, and then would later participate in the press gang if they were caught and brought into a ship. There's one example I know of for sure, I'll mention later, where a man who was pressed at one point in his career later participates in the press gang on the ship. It really was viewed as part of the world they were in. It sucked. Many hated it on a philosophical level and a personal level. But once you were pressed, that was it. That was your job. It was just part of that fluid maritime world for the most part. Then again, many had different views. It's all an individual basis, but for the most part, it was a really, really crappy part of the job.
I guess there is that sense of what the hell are you going to do about it anyway? We're sticking you on this ship. We sail at dawn. You know, who are you going to complain to? The captain? The captain's really not going to listen to you. One kind of pool of discontent, I guess, back home is, of course, the families. And I'm curious about this on two levels. One is whether or not families have an ability to turn around and go, what the hell? But, there is a legal precedent for this, which is why they're able to do it at all, as well as a historical precedent in that it's been going on for a heck of a long time in port towns and cities. The other thing that I'm curious about is whether or not family is an excuse to escape. So if, for example, you're married or, you have a number of children and there's this question mark of, well, what the heck do you expect me to do about providing for my family if you're going to then put me on this boat? I'm not going to get my pay particularly often, I'd imagine, because it's not as though ships sail around with huge quantities of bullion stashed on them. And even if you get it handed to you, it's not much use to your family back in England anyway. So how does that kind of play into this? And is there this facility to escape based on, marriage, kids, all the rest of it? And do people then exploit that?
To my knowledge, there wasn't such a loophole. Perhaps if you were quite an age sailor, you haven't been at sea for a decade or more, and you have a bunch of kids, and you could appeal to your captain, and maybe you get lucky. But I don't think that was a realistic expectation. Now, families in general of sailors in the Navy, the Jack Tars, they were provided for somewhat. They received some of their husbands' or their father's pay to keep them going. It definitely wasn't an easy life. It wasn't certain that they would receive the money. So on a financial level, it really sucked. And especially if you were impressed. If your husband volunteers for the Royal Navy, well, he's going to get a signing bonus, most likely, a financial bonus that he can then give to you. And he's probably going to be more likely to be given shore leave at some point in his career. If you're pressed, you don't get that signing bounty. You're probably not going to get any shore leave until you've proven that you were loyal. So that was definitely very hard. And another real problem is that many of these sailors can't read or write. So once you're pressed on board a ship, your wife might have no idea where you are. And certainly once you sail, they won't hear from you unless you have someone very kind on board who can read and write, who can do it for you. So, husbands and fathers would disappear for months and years on end routinely in this life. And that's why many sailors do not start families when they're young, because just how crazy this maritime life is. You could get on a boat in Bristol and you could be based in Halifax for 10 years. And there's just no real way to predict that. One really tragic thing too is a lot of impressment actually happens when homeward bound merchant ships are stopped just as they're entering a British port. So you could have a ship full of sailors, let's say 10 of them have families at home. They've been away for a year, sailed to the India and back. They're very excited to get home to see their families, and then they're immediately pressed, days away from reaching home. And the family would have no way of knowing, again, unless the sailor is able to get some word to them. And that requires either them to be literate or someone on the ship who can write for them. And of course, the wife to be literate as well.
Do you get people just kind of disappearing and I guess never coming home? Because the whole point about naval life is that there are many dangers, not just combat, which admittedly is the exception rather than the norm, but you're talking at the age of sail, health and safety really is not a thing during this period. And ships are hazardous environments at the best of times, storms, all the rest of it. Do you get those kind of cases that somebody went out, and got drunk one night, got pressed, and nobody ever saw them again because, next thing they were, found themselves on a ship, which then 6 months later ends up at the Battle of the Nile, or, insert equivalent story here?
Yeah, well, I mean, for one thing, sometimes entire ships disappear, and that happens throughout the age of sail. Even well into the 20th century, there are a few cases of ships just completely vanishing. So yes, absolutely. There are cases of men with families disappearing. I don't know any off the top of my head, but just has to have happened given the realities of maritime life. I don't want to give the impression that maritime life is like excessively more dangerous than life on land. It certainly was quite chaotic, unpredictable, and a ship is a dangerous place. But I think there's a danger in when we talk about it as historians of overselling that to some extent. Sailors did not board a ship and expect, I'm going to die soon, most likely. Most would come home, but not everyone. And sometimes that's because they were injured, lost, or sometimes they just, find a new life somewhere.
I guess the other, I'm conscious that we do need to kind of keep momentum going with this, but you talked about something earlier that was really interesting, which is about sort of the culture and almost the ethos of British society during this period. Everybody talking about how jealously Britain guards, notions of liberty, rule of law, habeas corpus, things that have been really integral to the British psyche, quite frankly, since the Glorious Revolution of 1689. These are things that the Brits pride themselves on during this period, and they hold them up as counters to everything that's happening in first revolutionary and then subsequently Napoleonic France. And it's very much this look, aren't we so much better than the rest kind of scenario that's played out, in the press, in the coffee houses and so on. So how does society at large deal with the fact that what they're doing is the exact inverse of all of that? Is there this sense of, well, someone's got to take one for the team? Is there any kind of indication of how people square the circle and kind of brush that under the carpet, or does it just get ignored? Just people just go, well, impressment, yeah, it's unfortunate, but let's move on.
That's the thing. It is a political embarrassment throughout the period. Politicians hate it. The Navy does not like it. In a perfect world, they would man the fleet with willing volunteers. And again, most of the men in the Navy are willing volunteers for whatever reason, but there's also this recognition. The fleet cannot sail at the scale that is needed without impressment. Without impressment, the Royal Navy could not have challenged Napoleonic France and survived the Napoleonic Wars. So there's that recognition. So it's an evil necessity. It's tolerated because it's necessary. And a good example of this is actually in Nova Scotia, which I'll talk more about in a moment as well. Because the residents and the political establishment there really detest impressment, really despise it. And whenever the Royal Navy shows up and unjustly, obstructs the liberties of Nova Scotian sailors and press them without cause, the entire community would rally against the Royal Navy. But Nova Scotians also permitted controlled, limited press gang activity in the province when it was judged to be necessary for manning the North American squadron. So when it was in, the national interest. So again, I'll tell you later, but Halifax hated the press gang, but tolerated it when it was necessary.
So this is really interesting. One last thing before we start to talk about some of these individuals and their experiences. You get a shortage of men, and that's a given. What about the officer corps? Because we have this very traditional perception of lots of families being quite eager in some cases, and Rory Muir has done some great work to demonstrate some of this attitude of, if you have a younger son and you're a wealthy gentleman, but you're not that wealthy, Navy life can be beneficial on a number of levels, not least, you take your 12-year-old son, you get him onto a ship as a midshipman, and off he goes, and you don't have to provide for him. The son, in the meantime, gets a career. He's got that career for life, should he so choose, and there are prospects of advancement. Yes, you've then got a whole thing of half pay, but do you have points at which the Royal Navy looks at the number of officers on its books and goes, we're going to run out of officers here if we're not careful? And if so, how do they deal with that? I know it's a sort of separate issue to impressment, because to my knowledge, you don't end up with impressed officers. But is there some sense of we need a strategy here to make sure we've got enough young men to fill the vacant positions on these ships? Because as you say, if you're going to expand a navy to almost sort of 10 times its original size, you still need officers to man those ships. You can't just fill them with your sailors, able seamen, and what have you. So I'm curious about how that works.
So, and actually, that is a question that nobody never considers because it's never a problem. There are always plenty of young gentlemen. The term used in the Navy to refer to anyone who aspires to be an officer do not have to actually be gentlemen by class. There are always enough of them. And you would think of the logistics here. And you think about a film like Master and Commander, where there's like a half a dozen or so young boys who are apprentice officers. And I forget, like HMS Surprise would actually have probably close to a dozen, so twice as many young gentlemen. Most would grow up and become, senior midshipmen, master's mates. Many would become lieutenants, and every ship would have, 2, 3, 4, 5, even 6 times as many lieutenants as captains. The Navy did a very good job of generating enough officers. In fact, too good of a job, because, and this happens with every major war of a period, there'd be a huge hiring spree and promotion spree of officers into the ranks of lieutenants and commanders and captains in the first half of the war. Second half of the war comes around, Navy's still expanding, but it gets to the point where you just have physically too many officers. At the height of the Napoleonic Wars, there are twice as many commanders as there are sloops for them to command. So at any one time, 50% of your commanders are unemployed. And then a smaller number of captains and lieutenants. But that's always a problem. And then when peace comes, in 1816, I think something like 90% of the lieutenants on, the Navy list were unemployed.
That is quite a figure. I'm very tempted to rabbit hole on that, but we'll resist that temptation because we're here to talk about impressment, so we should stay focused. So impressmen, what do we know about them? Do they just sort of disappear into the machinery of the Royal Navy, as you say, trying to get accounts from those who aren't literate? It is a huge challenge. Or can we trace some of their experiences?
I mean, 99% of them, yeah, they disappear into the machinery of the Navy. Like the most you get from most Jack tars is you can find their names on different ships, muster books. But how many, Jack tars, how many John Smiths are there? It's hard. There are a few historical accounts that have survived, and they're really fascinating ones. 2 that came to mind. I have one, I don't have the other one. William Spavins, he was a Jack tar in the mid 18th century. And he was pressed into service, and a surviving account describes his real distaste for the process, but he also describes, later in his career, joining press gangs and helping to impress other sailors. So he is someone who has a personal and philosophical disagreement with the process, but again accepts that his ship can't sail without it. It's now his duty to participate in it. Another excellent autobiography is Jacob Nagel, who recounts his experience throughout his career of evading and running from press gangs, of being caught by press gangs. We know he successfully pressed once, but he also describes many different attempts at evading the press gangs, from hiding in cupboards on ships to slipping ashore at night. It's very common for especially merchant ships to have compartments built into them to hide sailors. Because if you have 4 excellent seamen on board, if you can keep them, you're going to. Some of these compartments were excellently designed, others were absolutely pathetic, and they didn't fool anyone, especially press gang officers who did this quite often.
Yeah, I can imagine you get to know kind of the tricks of the trade after a while, don't you, and know the signs. I'm curious about how widespread this policy is as well. You kind of alluded to it already in relation to Halifax. This is a British problem, right? But you end up with Americans becoming embroiled in it. which tells you all sorts of things about how you end up with this kind of having an impact across the British Empire and potentially even beyond. So I guess my first question is kind of, is it better or worse outside of what you might call the home islands? So you've talked about Halifax particularly. Is Halifax sort of the go-to place? Does Halifax end up being stripped of naval recruits because there's this kind of sense of, well, if it's not in Britain, then perhaps we can get away with a bit more, or maybe we can push the boundaries a little bit further?
I can't speak to the West Indies or Gibraltar, but I can speak to how it worked in British North America. And I'll talk about two colonies, and because they are polar opposite cases. It really is dependent on the colony, the place in the world, the commanders involved, and the legal framework there. But the important context here is 1708, and a law passed by the very new British Parliament, known as the Sixth of Anne. I'm not a political historian, but I assume that is the sixth law passed in the reign of Queen Anne of Great Britain after the Act of Union. This law prohibited the impressment of sailors in the American colony. So if you were an American colonial, under British law, you weren't liable to impressment. The Royal Navy could apprehend deserters from British service, but could not impress American colonials. That's 1708. Now, this law was almost always ignored throughout the following century. It's one of the factors that saw relations between the colonists and the British state break down, leading up to the American Revolution. But that precedent is important. So I'll talk first of Newfoundland. So this is now a Canadian province. It was briefly an independent country before being recolonized by Britain in the 1930s. At the time, Newfoundland was really just like an extension of the West Country fishery, culturally and economically. Had a very small settled population. Its workforce mostly consisted of sailors traveling to and from England with the seasons. That's really all it was. It was a fisheries brand. There was no real local government in Newfoundland. Its colonial governor was actually just the commander-in-chief of the Newfoundland squadron, naval squadron. So there, press gangs were completely under control of the Navy, under the whims of the Navy, but they were infrequent. And they were infrequent because the squadron's tiny. Usually it's only a handful of ships. And usually they had no problem getting seamen to leave the fisheries and volunteer into the Navy. It was a really good place to be if you wanted to take on willing volunteers. By contrast, Nova Scotia, which is not too far away, has a very different political context. Nova Scotia, before the American Revolution, was known as the 14th colony. After being taken by the French in the 1710s, and its French-Acadian population was deported during the 7 Years' War, it was settled by New England families. And they brought with them new English ideas about governance and rights. The colony remained loyal during the Revolution, and it's later settled by thousands of loyalists, but that political culture remains important because of its new English roots. Nova Scotia is really opposed to impressment, and the local government uses its colonial infrastructure to control it. So the capital of Nova Scotia, Halifax, was the home of the North American Squadron. This was a fleet that was always desperate for manpower. Especially in the Napoleonic Wars, they were probably the lowest priority of the big fleets because there was virtually no French presence in the area. So they didn't get reinforcements from England in terms of manpower. So they could only recruit locally, and that required, press gangs or volunteers. But because of the Sixth of Anne and the legal framework that exists, that the Royal Navy now has to pay attention to because they learned their lesson in the 1770s, the fleet can only send press gangs into Halifax or other ports under a warrant issued by the Nova Scotia Legislative Assembly. And even then, Nova Scotians are, for the most part, exempt from impressment. So between 1793 and 1805, 13 warrants are issued by the government that allow the Royal Navy to conduct the press gangs. And these warrants control how long press gangs can operate for and how many men they can grab in total. And because Nova Scotians have a lot of exemptions from impressment, it's not uncommon for a majority of the press gang's captures to be released afterwards. It gets really bad in 1805. This is the height of the crisis. The squadron's so undermanned that they're sending ships to Newfoundland to take on crew because they just can't get them in Halifax. But in 1805, the squadron is desperate, and the commander-in-chief, Vice Admiral Andrew Mitchell, sends press gangs into Halifax without a warrant from the local government. This results in a violent riot in the town. The government and the Navy are so spooked by it that no further warrants are issued for press gangs from 1805 until the War of 1812, 7 years later.
Millions of people have lost weight with personalized plans from Noom, like Evan, who can't stand salads and still lost 50 pounds.
Salads generally for most people are the easy button, right? For me, that wasn't an option. I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. But Noom worked for me.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
Hiring for your small business? If you're not looking for professionals on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. That's like looking for your car keys in a fish tank. LinkedIn helps you hire professionals you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job but might be open to the perfect role. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't even visit other leading job sites. So start looking in the right place. With LinkedIn, you can hire professionals like a professional. Post your free job on linkedin.com/spoken today.
See, this leads me on very nicely to where I wanted to go next, which was to talk about resistance to impressment. So lovely little piece of segueing for me there, much appreciated, doing my job for me. There must be some entertaining stories within this, but also, I guess, also some quite heartbreaking ones. Talk us through, the ones that you've come across.
Unfortunately, I don't know of too many, and they must be out there. And if your listeners know of any, hit me up on Twitter. I'd love to hear about some of them. I know general trends. I know that sailors would, if they wanted to avoid the Royal Navy, they knew where press gangs were. Press gangs were occasionally patrolling the streets in a British town, or they were stopping merchant ships as they go in and out of British ports. So, they would hide in cupboards on merchant ships. They would slip ashore at night, hide in inns, alleys, try to flee the port town while the Navy was there, and only come back into town when the Navy is gone. And some, when they were encountered a press gang, they resist with violence. And like in Halifax, this occasionally results in real violence. So the situation in 1805 in Halifax was that the Navy, because the manpower crisis was the worst it had been for the entire war, they requested a warrant from the Nova Scotia government. And Nova Scotia government was receptive. Again, they recognized that it's necessary. So they offered them the most liberal press warrant they'd ever offered. For a fortnight, they were allowed to impress an unlimited number of sailors, as long as they're legally entitled to impressment. The commander-in-chief, though, Admiral Mitchell, protested, saying that a fortnight was just not enough time. He needed a longer allowance, and the Assembly denied this because they said there's no precedent for longer impressment. There's no real evidence that it'll be effective after a fortnight. This is what you've got. This is the best we've ever given you. Calm down. And at this point, the admiral and all of his captains in Halifax, they are desperate to try and impress sailors because there's a lot of sailors in Halifax. I mean, probably half of them are not actually Nova Scotians, and they know they're there and they want them. So rather than take the olive branch, Admiral Mitchell sends in press gangs anyway into Halifax and several other ports. And it's a major riot ensues. One man is killed and half a dozen are injured, at least. Fascinatingly, though, this is mid-1805. Just like a couple months later, news arrives of the Battle of Trafalgar, of the victory. And this same town that a couple months ago had been the subject of violent protests over impressment was fully consumed by joyous celebrations of the British victory. these protests were not anti-British. This was not an anti-British town. They were anti-impressment specifically. The same people who would go, into the streets to fight against a press gang to protect their, fellow sailors, fellow citizens, would go in the street and celebrate Nelson's victory, and they did. It was a tremendous celebration that lasted weeks and days and weeks following the victory.
So how do we get from this to the context within which, during the war, the run-up rather, to the War of 1812, what the Royal Navy is doing here ends up effectively rubbing the USA up the wrong way? And this is a dumb and obvious question, but I'm sure you can shed more light onto it than the way that I'm phrasing it. Why is the USA affected? How is it that American sailors end up being drawn into this and then the US end up kicking off about it?
Well, I mean, and again, the basic level, the Royal Navy is impressing American citizens. That's what's happening, but it's complex. But that's a grievance that the war hawks of the American Congress used to sell the war to a very skeptical country. And in the lead up to the War of 1812, there were two really explosive, quite literally explosive confrontations about this. In 1807, HMS Leopard, a very old, outdated 50-gun ship of the line, fires on an unsuspecting and unprepared frigate USS Chesapeake because they had heard that there were British deserters on board. The Chesapeake was not prepared for action. They had no reason to be prepared for action. This is 1807. So they're forced to strike because they're fired on. 4 men are pulled off by the British. 3 actually were British deserters, but the 4th probably was not. And this results in huge outcry in the United States. A few years later, in 1911, HMS Guerriere apprehended an American merchant ship, and impressed several men out of her. Again, supposedly all British subjects. This quickly resulted in huge hysteria in the United States, and USS President, one of the Americans' heavy frigates, is deployed to search for Guerriere. What the heck they were going to do when they found Guerriere, we don't know, because this is a time of peace. But she was sent out to find this frigate. President did not find Guerriere, however. She instead found the much smaller sloop of war HMS Little Belt. What followed is not really clear, but we know that a firefight ensues. Both ships fire on each other. And poor Little Belt is ridiculously outgunned here. She is a 20-gun ship, and President is the heaviest frigate afloat in the world. 56 guns, very heavy guns. Both captains claim the ever fired first. I cannot imagine that Captain Bingham of Little Belt would have done so. It'd be absolutely ludicrous. But whatever case, it happened, and men died. Not many, but men died. This event inflamed the British, just as Leopard had done so to the Americans in 1807. The British accused the actions of President and her captain as cowardly because she'd attacked a much smaller ship. She had mistaken supposedly for Guerriere. So when the War of 1812 does break out, Captain de Crez of Guerriere has the slogan, "Not to the Little Belt," painted onto his topsails, just to be sure a president wouldn't make the same mistake twice. So why are the Royal Navy stopping American ships, even like ships of the American Navy? Because it wasn't a secret. Thousands of British-born sailors served in American ships. Pay was better, life was safer. America was only briefly at war during this period, very briefly against France in the Quasi War and then the Barbary States. For the most part, it's a peaceful existence. You have better pay. You're theoretically safe from French privateers, British press gang. So why wouldn't you serve in the American merchant ships and American Navy? The British claimed at the time that 20,000 British subjects were employed in American ships. The US government claimed it was actually 9,000, which is still a staggering sum. It was about 1/5 of the entire maritime workforce of the United States. Now, it's important to clarify a couple legal matters here, because this is a deep philosophical difference in the two countries. So first off, under British law, only British subjects can be impressed. So if you're from Britain, Ireland, and around the Empire, but it's limited if you're from British North America, you're liable to impressment if you have maritime experience. So two, by extension, natural-born American citizens cannot be impressed. Officially, the Royal Navy cannot impress Americans. but there's some problems with that. One, it was usually up to the pressed man to prove that he was American, and that's difficult because you might not have papers on you. Papers might not be believed. This is a time when it was very easy to get American citizenship, ridiculously easy, which anyone, I know people who are trying to go through American immigration system now will tear their hair out at the thought of that because it's really hard now, but it was ridiculously easy at the time. So during this period, historians think 10,000 individuals with some claim American citizenship were impressed. 3,000 are later released because they can prove that they are not British, they're in fact American, but 7,000 who have a claim to American citizenship remain in British service. Why? Well, if they were American citizens, might not be able to prove it. But more problematic, if an American citizen had been born in Britain, in Ireland, in Canada, Nova Scotia, they're still entitled to it. Subjecthood is not the same as citizenship. In the British, legal framework, if you're born a subject of the king, you remain a subject of the king until you die, even if you leave the British Empire. American citizenship, on the other hand, is something that you, as free men, can choose to accept or revoke however you like. So many of these individuals, these 1,000 individuals, were legally American citizens under American law, but under British law, they're also British subjects. So that's where this crisis really comes from. It's this philosophical difference between American citizenship and British subjecthood.
And it is worth saying that impressment is just one part of a wider policy that's hacking off the USA and antagonizing them at this point, right?
Absolutely. It is closely linked with a much broader policy towards the United States, which Americans bitterly resented. So even after independence, the British were always treating the Americans with, contempt, really. They thought of the Americans as, this citizens of this backwater, quasi-vassal state. They considered them crass and vulgar, and they considered their government essentially basically a doomed experiment in a form of radical British ideology. And that's what it was. And this is in the context of the broader war to Napoleonic France. So in 1807, you have the collapse of the Fourth Coalition, I think. And Britain is still at war with Napoleonic France. Napoleonic France cannot, challenge Royal Navy at sea. They respond with the continental system by embargoing British trade with the continent. Britain responds by intensifying its economic blockade of France. So it becomes an economic war. And so in 1807, the British issue a series of orders in council, which basically set the framework for how this economic blade is going to be conducted. They forbade British, Allied, and neutral shipping from trading with the French Empire. Now, neutral is key there. To accomplish this, they authorized British warships to stop and search all shipping attempting to access the European market. Ships which did not comply were liable to seizure. This includes American vessels, because it explicitly says that neutrals are under this authority, which from the United States perspective is ridiculous because they're not subject to British law, but the British don't really care.
Yeah, this is the point where, for all that I do bash Napoleon for trying to dictate the economic policy of an entire continent with the continental system, the British are absolutely playing the same game and being completely awful about the whole thing, quite frankly. And if you're in the USA shoes, you can absolutely see why this escalates. Do we have any cases of sedition from impressed Americans over this kind of discrepancy of, legal definition? Because you have a situation where you could actually be impressed prior to, as an American born in a British colony or born in Britain, you could be impressed prior to the outbreak of the war and then find yourself in a situation where you're now having to fight your fellow countrymen in a naval force that you never wanted to join in the first place. So do we have instances of this kind of tension kind of leading to sparks and expressions of discontent?
So, and again, I don't know of any specific instances. I'm sure it must have happened. I'm sure, like, if you protested to your captain, your captain probably not going to report it. But if your listeners know of anything, please let me know. I'd love to hear it. I do have an example of the opposite happening, however. So early in the war, a British-born sailor on USS Essex under Captain David Porter, he approached his captain and said, "Hey, look, I'm a British subject. I don't want to fight against my country. You were great to serve under, but I would respectfully want to, leave your service." It was actually pretty easy to leave American naval service because they always had plenty of recruits. So it was a much freer system than the British system. The crew, however, really quickly turns against this guy because they feel that he's betraying, their righteous cause, free trade and sailors' rights. And they petition their captain to make an example of this bloke. They want to tar and feather him. Not in a lethal sense, but, tarring and feathering. And David Porter says yes. And he lets the crew tar and feather the poor sailor. He manages to flee the ship. He seeks refuge with the local police, and it explodes. It gets into the papers. It's a big scandal. Porter himself reports this to his boss, the Secretary of the Navy. He offers up the story. His letter implies that he didn't think there was any problem with this behavior. He's rebuked pretty handily by the secretary because it was quite appalling. And word of this spreads. This is right at the end of the War of 1812, and it reaches Halifax, and it's quite outrageous people there. And very soon after, a very inflammatory challenge appears in Philadelphia newspapers, supposedly written by Captain Yeo of the Royal Navy, then commanding HMS Southampton. He would later go on to command British squadrons on the Great Lakes. In this challenge, Yeo demanded that Porter in Essex come out to meet him in his frigate so that the injustice of the Jack Tar could be avenged. And so that he could, and I quote, "I can break my sword over your damned head."
I mean, that's not exactly conciliatory language, is it? We did discuss this, I believe, didn't we? In relation to single ship actions during...
I believe we did, yes.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. So we won't repeat that for folks, but people, this is why you want to go back and listen to this episode, because it's an incredible story. And again, you're doing my job for me, because this leads us onto the next kind of section of this, which is about US responses and how the US protests against this policy. And we've talked about, this is something that the hawkish politicians in Washington can seize upon. But there must have been diplomatic discussions over this, because this is fundamentally a diplomatic incident prior to the war breaking out. So how does the USA turn around and go, "Oi, this isn't on, stop it, or else"? And what's the UK response to that, which I'm guessing, well, I was going to be flippant and say I'm guessing the response is, look, get lost, matey. But there is a certain irony in this whole thing, which is that the British are on the cusp of repealing the Orders in Council at the point at which news arrives that the US has declared war. So I'm curious about how that actually plays out in reality.
So, and bear with me, listeners, because there's some politics that are important here. So at first, in 1807, the Americans very quickly issue formal diplomatic protests, like very forceful protests. They are pissed off at their ships and citizens being seized. In the short term, these diplomatic challenges are a complete failure. The they do kind of threaten they might go to war and invade Canada, but the British can, they have spies in America. They can see that the fleet's in a terrible state. They don't have any reliable troops. And in 1807, no one thinks there's going to be a war. So Britain does extend an olive branch, and they agree to pay reparations to released American sailors. So if they impress someone who can prove that they're not a British subject, they pay them a limited amount. And they agree they will stop seizing American warships. So Chesapeake will not happen again. But the British do not relent on the Orders in Council's, right to search neutral merchants nor impress British subjects. So that's unresolved. The Americans then try to join the economic warfare game. They issue an embargo on food exports to the British Empire. Congress is betting that Britain will suffer about these exports, and especially the West Indian colonies, maybe even Nova Scotia, will really suffer because it's a very connected maritime trade world. But they overestimate just how reliant Britain is. And unfortunately, it's poorly timed because it happens just as Spain switches sides in the war. Suddenly, Latin American markets are open to the British. So rather than harm the British economy and supply of food, it probably is just a boon to British commerce because now merchants who are no longer have to compete with Americans when they're within the British market.
Yeah, there is that very much that sense of this is an opportune moment, isn't it? And if the US wants to engage in a sort of tit for tat trade war of sorts, well, hey, these new markets have opened up, and the British have really wanted to get their hands on the South American markets for a heck of a long time. So the coincidences of that are quite beneficial to the Brits in this. But we do get to a situation where the UK does fold effectively, and it does decide to repeal the Orders in Council. What's the reasoning for that? Is it just that it's quite obvious that this system isn't really working, or is it genuinely part of an attempt to put the genie back in the bottle, if you will, and sort of look, if we deal with this, then perhaps we can kind of smooth everything over and stop this war, and that'll be the end of it?
So that is why they do it. This happens, though, because of a change of political leadership. In summer of 1812, a disgruntled merchant marches into Parliament and shoots the Prime Minister, Spencer Perceval. Perceval was quite hawkish when it came to foreign policy for the USA. He was the architect of the Orders in Council. He was quite keen on it continuing. He saw the benefits outweighing the negatives. His successor, Lord Liverpool, however, is not that such a hawk. He prioritized the cooling of relations, and so he extended the olive branch. On June 16th, in the House of Commons, Lord Castlereagh announces that they are going to repeal the Orders in Council. June 16th, this is announced, 1812. June 18th, Congress declares war in the United Kingdom. So they hear of the news on both sides around the same time, at which point hostilities already begun on land and sea. So it literally is a matter of days in between.
Yeah, it's remarkable, isn't it? A few days either side, and well, a few days earlier, effectively, or a few days later on the American side, and you wouldn't have this conflict at all. Well, I say a few days, but you've obviously got the time for the news to travel. But nonetheless, you get what I mean. I guess this is a bit of a counterfactual, but would it have gone far enough to solving the USA's grievances? Because there's always a distinction to be made between what should be happening in theory and what actually happens on the ground. So is there this sort of sense that this would have made the difference had impressment just stopped, full stop? Would that have been enough, or actually is it the economic thing that's the key here? Which I guess takes me on to kind of my final question, which is how significant is impressment in the outbreak, or is impressment sort of an excuse, something that fans the flames but is subsidiary to the bigger political picture?
Mm-hmm. This is still hotly debated. My own feelings, I'll talk about the counterfactual first. Let's say they hold off on the vote to declare war for another couple months, and they hear Order in Councils are revoked, which would be a significant concession, because that was something that Americans really pissed off about. The war was never popular in the United States. There was the war hawk faction in Congress who really wanted it. New England politicians and merchants absolutely wanted to avoid it at all costs. There's President Madison and his circle who were ambivalent on it from the beginning. If the Orders in Council did not happen, I don't think it could have stopped the war, but I think it could have delayed, that drumbeat to war for some time, and that would be important, because in 1812 there's an opportunity for Americans. Britain's army is stuck in the peninsula. There is no European coalition to speak of. There's the beginnings of the war in Russia, but Napoleon is at the height of his power here. So the Americans bet, we can use the opportunity, take Canada, force the British to come to terms. Let's say Orders in Council are revoked. Impressment's still a problem. So it's very likely that the same demands for war would have come about, but maybe a year later or 2 years later. But what's happening in summer 1813? Napoleon has lost campaigns in Germany. 1814, he is gone. I can't imagine they would have risked a war with Britain at that stage, because you no longer have the advantage. And we know from what happens once the war in Europe is done, Britain sends a bunch of ships and thousands of men, and they literally go and burn down the U.S. Capitol. It's not a war that Americans wanted to fight. They wanted to fight a war where Britain could do very little about it. In terms of how significant impressment was overall, and that's always been the question. Is it significant in the outbreak, or is it an excuse? And it's both. It is really significant in the outbreak of War of 1812, as the Orders in Council were. For many, it was the primary motive, especially the few in New England who wanted to go to war. That was the only reason. And that's reflected in the sloganeering of the time. Many ships sailed with a banner saying free trade and sailors' rights, when they went into war. But it was also an excuse for many others. There were various political factions in the United States, the war hawks especially, who had been clamoring for war with the United Kingdom for a long time over a more tangible grievance, and that was Canada, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and the other British North American colonies. For many Americans, the work of the Revolution was not finished. Canada had been invaded during that conflict, but remained a British possession. There was a miserable attempt at rebellion in Nova Scotia that failed. This colony, again, was extension to New England. Why shouldn't it be brought into the American Republic? The economic issues, the impressment, these are all matters that could have been solved diplomatically if they'd wanted to. If enough American politicians wanted a peaceful solution, they could have fought for that. Difficult. It had not been successful at this point, but that issue of an unfinished revolution in Canada was always there. For someone like President Madison, I suspect that without impressment in the Orders in Council, he would not have gone to war. But there are many in Congress who it was an excuse. They wanted to finish that revolution and to seize upon the chance that they had in 1812. Britain seems to be losing a war. It will not be able to send many reinforcements, hardly any ships, and they don't really for the first year of this conflict. The North American Squadron, the British Army get very little in terms of reinforcements until the situation changes in Europe. And I think this sentiment is expressed actually by Thomas Jefferson, former president. He writes to a colleague in 1812, just after the war breaks out, and in it he says that famous line, "The acquisition of Canada this year, as far as the neighborhood of Quebec, will be a mere matter of marching, and will give us experience for the attack of Halifax and the next, and then the final expulsion of England from the American continent."
That tells you everything you need to know, doesn't it, in terms of some of the psyches that are playing out in Washington during this period. And you do make a very good point that 1811, 1812, first half of 1812 at least, the idea that Britain is going to win this war is very much up in the air. It's very strong opposition domestically back in the UK to the war. 1810-11 is the point at which the opposition party really manages to bite with some stinging critiques of the fact that the Peninsular War is not really going anywhere. 1810-11 is the stalemate, and people will go, well, yeah, 1812, you get breakout with Salamanca, but Salamanca's in July. Before that, okay, so you've got Theodore Rodrigo and Badajoz. That doesn't automatically radically change the situation across Europe. Yes, it enables strategic options for Wellington in the Iberian Peninsula. It's not something that Napoleon's looking at and thinking, oh no, I better not invade Russia because two fortresses on the Spanish border have fallen. And it's really interesting to just kind of take us out of that Peninsular War kind of constant march to victory mindset and think about how, if you don't have that knowledge of what comes next, it's very easy to think in 1811-12, Britain's going to lose this one way or another. Something's just going to go wrong. And also you've got big issues with economics, which really bite over this period.
And you also, because the good news, of Salamanca, it's going to take about 2 months for Congress to learn about that. in Britain, I think they learn about the declaration of war about 45 days after it happens, and vice versa for the repeal of the Orders in Council. So you're dealing with a 2-month gap of important news. So summer of 1812, Britain looks like it's losing, and America is feeling really confident, even though they don't have a good reason to be, because their navy's tiny, their army's poorly managed, their militiamen are not reliable, but they see an opportunity and they take it.
Nick, it's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you for this. I know we ended up kind of morphing it into a discussion about origins, but actually that's fantastic because there was going to be an episode on origins, and sadly I couldn't get a guest to come on and talk about that. So you've managed to kind of cover something that I think perhaps might have perplexed some people who aren't familiar with the history of this conflict. So there you go, folks. You got 2 for the price of 1 out of this guy. So thank you very much for that, Nick. Folks, Revenge in the Name of Honour, the Royal Navy's quest for vengeance in the single ship actions of the War of 1812, is available at hellion.co.uk. I don't know if there's a January sale going on at Hellion, but why not have a look? It's a book that frankly is well worth paying the full price for anyway. So just go buy it. Why not? I'll make sure there's a link to the Hellion page so that you can just go direct from the show description in the bit underneath where you're listening to this. Nick, thank you so much for joining me. I'm sure you're going to be back at some point. I know you're very keen to participate in a sort of championship of the greatest soldier of the Napoleonic era. More on that in a little while, folks. But thank you for your time. I look forward to chatting again very soon.
Cheers, Zach. I'm looking forward to being back.
Folks, remember what I said at the start. Please remember to like, subscribe and share with a friend. 3 simple things that make a huge difference. If you're particularly loving the show, why not head over to Apple Podcasts where you can leave a 5-star review and make sure you add a comment as well so that I can get your feedback on what's working on the show. As ever, a huge thank you to my Patreon supporters. You can get your hands on bonus content, hours upon hours of additional material, episodes on the Marshals, on the American Revolution, exclusive chats on a wide range of things, in addition to a whole host of perks. Make sure that you avail yourself of those benefits if you are inclined. Obviously, I completely understand that that may not be for everybody, and whatever support you're able to give, it means a huge amount, whatever form it takes. Particular shout-outs. Those who are mentioned in dispatches are Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, John Haynes, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Lucy Tatner, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Andrew Leon, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Coulson, Jim Getz, Jeff Maple, Ed Koss, Indiana Fats, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meeking, Mark Anscombe, Bruins Girl, Mark Trowbridge, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Rachel Stark, Chris Pramus, Anthony Gombow, Andrew Wright, Graham Spicer, Keys Bishop, Anonymous American, Martin Pisani, Sam Gurman, Marcus Cribb, Robin Brasher, Hospitaller, and James Fluick. The Admirals are David Priest, Rob Coughlin, Graham Callister, Mark Duckers, and Michael Guest. The Marshals are Rory Muir, Bob Burnham, Matt Bone, Graham Swidenbank, Colin Zimmerman, Ryan Diamond, Sean Sullivan, David Maxwell, and Juo Teixeira. The Emperor, that's J.C. Kaizer, and the Legion de Scholars, Liam Telfer, and Todd and Laird Campbell. I'll be back very soon, but until then, I'm Zach White. This has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Stay well, stay safe. A very Merry Christmas to you all. And as always, thank you for listening.